Hello, I'm David Caputo, Professor of Political Science at Pace University in New York City, and I'd like to welcome you to a lecture on money and the presidential nominating process. This is the second of the money lectures that I've given, and I want to make sure that we'll probably come back to this in greater depth a little later in the nominating process, but I wanted to bring you up to date. Remember earlier in the course in Money 1, in the lecture on money, I talked about individual contributions and limitations. Go back and take a look at that video again and look at that particular table. Today I want to talk about probably two of the least understood aspects of money, and that is what are called PACs, Political Action Committees, and Super PACs. Okay, Super Political Action Committees. Let me try to explain each of them to you. Okay, first of all, remember that in the Buckley decision, the Supreme Court said that it was possible to put limitations on contributions to parties and political organizations without violating one's First Amendment freedom of speech rights. They also said it was possible not to put limits on expenditures. The federal election law in the 1970s put limits on what could be spent in campaigns and so forth. They argued that that was in fact an abridgment of those organizations' First Amendment rights to speech and so forth. So they outlawed limits on expenditures but okayed limits on contributions. So keep that distinction clear. So one of the things that came up and developed then were what were called political action committees. Now a political action committee is something separate from a campaign committee. Campaign committee is set up for Jane Jones for Congress, and set up by Jane Jones as a way for people to contribute and so forth. A political action committee is normally set up either by independents or by people affiliated with that individual, with the candidate, or it could be the candidates themselves. And what a political action, they've been around since the mid-70s, and some, you could argue, even earlier. They raise money for candidates or issues. So there's limits on what can be contributed here. You also have to register, and you have to register the PAC, and you have to disclose who's contributed to the PAC. Okay, and that's through the Federal Election Commission. So an example of a PAC is a so-called leadership PAC. This will be a PAC formed by perhaps a member of Congress or a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate, who then takes contributions into that PAC, and they will use that as a way to support other candidates in the legislature, possibly as a way to incur goodwill among those individuals, possibly as a way to try to influence the composition of the House and the Senate. So the leadership PAC, formed by an office holder, they can make contributions to other candidates. There are limits as to how much you can contribute. I believe it's $5,000 per election. And you can also use the leadership PAC as a way to meet other election results. Okay? So you have leadership PACs, you have single candidate PACs, you have multi-candidate PACs. Now, the argument and the issue that gets the most attention today and the most criticism, and certainly has been part of the major criticism used by Senator Sanders, is a so-called super PAC. Okay, now, super PACs are an outgrowth of a court decision in 2010 called Citizens United. Okay, Citizens United was a group incorporated as a not-for-profit under Wisconsin law. They had a video which they were showing that was very anti-Hillary Clinton. That video, they then wanted to be able to purchase time to run the video nationally. The Federal Election Commission said, no, you cannot, because you're really in the state of Wisconsin as a corporation, not as a nonprofit, but still as a corporation. Therefore, you have to register with us and do a variety of other things. They said, no, no. They went to the courts, eventually, and ended up in the Supreme Court, and the court ruled 5-4, okay, with the usual conservative liberal split on the court, 5-4, that the freedom of speech in the United States, freedom of speech applies to corporations as well as individuals. This is a landmark decision in the sense it's the first time that the court said corporations have the same rights as individuals under the Constitution. Therefore, to limit their ability to show that, to limit their ability to act as a group, would mean then that they would not be able to have their First Amendment right of free speech. Okay? I recall, in the State of the Union, when the State of the Union was given in 2010, the President Obama, actually mentioned the Citizens United decision and how he thought it would set back campaign reform and campaign finance while he was in the well of the House, giving his State of the Union message. It was not well received by most members of the court because they felt he politicized it. All right, now, the decision also has gone on to be applied to unions and business associations, meaning that they can do the same thing. Means that they can make unlimited expenditures, no limit on their expenditures, and they can receive unlimited contributions, okay, from individuals. Okay? So these are the so-called super PACs, and they've evolved under what is called the 527 committees under the IRS code. And under the code, you can raise and spend money for political activities, such as voter mobilization efforts, issue advocacy, and candidate support. You register with the IRS under 527. You register with the IRS and you report funding and donors. So you can go to the Federal Election Commission and find your way through the various election reporting things that they have, and then you find out who is responsible. Now, there, however, are 3 or 4 exceptions, and these exceptions are what most people object to. Not all. First is what is called a 501c3. This is a not-for-profit, tax-exempt group. It might be a church, it might be a charity. They do not have to report donors, okay, under this, and they're permitted in some cases to do 501c3, they're permitted to do some non-election, non-advocacy things such as voter registration. Thus, an organization that might have been in existence to further some sort of social program could argue that they have a right to try to do a voter registration drive and use their funds accordingly. That's fine. Courts have ruled that's fine. And then 501c4 are social welfare organizations which can engage in political activities as long as the activities are not their primary purposes. Note, there's 2 steps. Are you engaged in political activity? Yes. The political activity is okay as long as it's not your primary purpose. So you can't form a 501c4 just for political purposes. It has to be formed for other things. 501c5 and 501c6 are labor and agricultural groups. Those are the C5. And C6 include business leagues, Chamber of Commerce, so forth. They are again able, okay, to raise large amounts of money as a super PAC, but they cannot do it if it's their primary purpose. So a Chamber of Commerce, what's their primary purpose? To raise funds to help business. They can also raise funds to get a political message out there, but it cannot be their primary. So what's the test? And that's the issue. How do you measure whether what's primary or not? Is it looking at all the money you've spent in a year and how much has been used for political? The other thing about super PACs is that they have to be independent of the candidate's campaign, which means they can advertise, spend money on soft activities such as voter registration, getting the vote out and so forth, but they have to do it without any contact, direct or indirect, with various candidates' campaign. So, in other words, when you see ads run by the super PACs, they will not say at the end, I'm candidate X, Y, or Z, and I support this ad, because that ad would have been run by the campaign. This ad is being run by a super PAC. So super PACs are notorious for attack ads, and under the rules, they do not have to divulge who their donors are. So this is where the term dark money, some of the consumer groups and Center for Responsible Politics and so forth like to call these funds dark funds because you don't know where they're coming from. You can make some assumptions, but you don't know for sure exactly. Under PACs, however, you do know. So the super PACs, especially the ones under the 501c3, 4, 5, and 6, have the ability to hide who their donors are. Now, going back to the question in a previous lecture where you heard Grover Norquist talk about the politicalization of the IRS, he was talking about the auditing of different groups. He is correct, and that is that during the campaign in 2008 and afterwards, the IRS did single out some groups who had Tea Party names in them and so forth to make sure that in fact they were spending the preponderance amount of their money on things other than campaigns. It's the only way that you could tell. Nonetheless, they were criticized and it became an important political issue. So controlling these super PACs is next to impossible, very difficult. Campaign supposedly has no interaction with them. So if a candidate thinks an ad is too negative, tough. They could ask that it be withdrawn if it's supporting them and negative about one of their candidates, but the chances that it would be very slim. Now, what about the going forward? Another aspect about dark money is that, again, when you see the ads and you see the contributions and so forth, you aren't sure where it's coming from, and you aren't quite sure who's responsible for it. There is some research being done as to whether or not former campaign workers for different candidates are on the active groups and so forth. So it'd be interesting to see. Now, just to give you an example, I want to give you some totals. This is from the Federal Election Commission and put together by the Center for Responsible Politics. For instance, Hillary Clinton in her campaign committee, to date, this is mid-February, has raised $126 million. She also has a super PAC called Priorities USA Action. It's a super PAC. She has no control over it. They have raised about $51 million, which they're free to use any way they want. She has no say over it. When you look at, let's look at Senator Sanders. He does not have a super PAC, he claims, and he's right, he doesn't. However, let me find the name of it here. The Progressive Voters of America, which is a leadership PAC, has raised $23,000, okay, so it's insignificant. There's a super PAC called Feel Burn, F-E-E-L-B-E-R-N, Feel Burn. They've raised $12,000. So he is correct that he does not have a large super PAC. He says he doesn't want it, and he wants to reform, as Secretary Clinton and some of the Republican candidates have said, they would reform some of the super PAC things. Let's look at the Republicans for just a minute running. Remember in the discussion we had after the Nevada Republican caucuses, I pointed out, after the Republican South Carolina primary, I pointed out that Jeb Bush had actually raised, his super PAC had raised close to $100 million and probably spent $90 million of it. Okay? So that gives you some idea about the number of individuals and the amount of money there. But let's look at Ted Cruz. Cruz has, his campaign is called Cruz for President, and it's raised $54 million. You go down, Keep the Promise. He has 3 super PACs. Keep the Promise 1, Keep the Promise 2, Keep the Promise 3. One has raised $15 million, one raised $11 million, and one has raised $10 million. So there's close to $40 million that Cruz has in super PAC money. He does not have, but it's been raised in his behalf. You look at someone such as John Kasich. Let me find his super PAC here. Sorry, because it is somewhat interesting. Can't find it. But he has raised about $8 million, not he, the super PAC, I'm sorry. See, I make the same mistake other people make. New Day for America is his super PAC. And that super PAC has raised almost $7 million. The Kasich campaign has raised $8 million. Super PAC has raised $7 million. So they will use that money, the super PAC will use that money when they want to run ads or do other things to help the campaign. When you look at Senator Rubio, Marco Rubio for president, which is his campaign committee, has raised $43 million, but Rubio Conservative Solutions okay, PAC as a super PAC, and he's raised about $33 million. So you can see that all the candidates, except Senator Sanders, have extensive amounts of money with some super PACs, with there's one other exception, and that's Donald Trump. Donald J. Trump for president has raised about $26 million to date, but when you look at super PACs for Trump, there's a super PAC called Patriots for Trump, which has raised $132,000, that's all. Committee to Restore America's Greatness has raised $30,000. So he also does not have a large super PAC. His largest would be his Make America Great Again. It's a super PAC, and it's raised a little bit under $2 million. So you can see in terms of super PACs, they have been less drawn to his candidacy on the Republican side than they've been drawn to others. So hopefully this helps to clarify it. I want to come back later, and we'll have a more extensive talk about PACs and super PACs and the impact they have. But most people assume that the campaign committees, the various campaign committees, raise about half the money that's going to be spent in a political campaign, and the PACs and super PACs raise the other half. So if we're talking about a $2 billion bill for the nominating race amongst all the candidates, it would be roughly $1 billion in campaign contributions, $1 billion in non-campaign contributions. And people are very concerned about both, saying it's too expensive, a candidate spends too much of their time raising money with all the implications of that, but also that the super PAC possibilities keep the public from knowing who truly might be supporting a campaign. Okay? So we'll come back and talk about this, but I want to contrast this with the table we saw earlier in terms of individual contributions. This is something that will be a major issue, I'm sure, in the campaign, but we'll see what happens afterwards in terms of whether or not there's any significant change. Thank you.